the first lecture in the Applications of Artificial Intelligence in Medicine course. I am your presenter today. My name is Chun. I am a third-year biochemistry student, and I am the VP Education for AIMS. So let's start off this by going over the outline for this lecture. First, we'll talk about what natural language processing is, and then we'll talk about electronic health records, the current issues with the electronic health record system, and how NLP can help solve them. Then we will talk about chatbots, and we'll go through some other applications at the end. So natural language processing, if you guys don't already know, is a branch of artificial intelligence that gives computers the ability to understand spoken and written words in the same way that humans can. So basically, this is done through a number of ways. Usually, the computer tries to break up the spoken or written language into little pieces so that they can understand each piece within the context of others. And that is basically the simplest way that I can put it. So next, we are going to talk about electronic health records because for natural language processing, most of the information and data that it uses to do its job, it comes from electronic health records, since this is obviously the largest body of information we have that's in a textual form. So information included in the electronic health record are a patient's medical history, their diagnoses, medications, laboratory and test results, and a lot more. And previously, this was done with a paper chart, but now in recent years, it has become much more common to adopt electronic health record. So by now, it is about 90% of all healthcare services have electronic health records instead of paper. So this improves continuity, which is important for chronic health diseases, so that you can see the progress of a patient's health and what changes there have been recently. Also, it allows the storage of large amounts of data, so it takes up much less space than to have paper charts. And also, it has ease of access so that physicians can look at a patient's chart easily, and they don't have to go around and find it, something that physically exists. So most of the information on this slide is also covered in our introductory to artificial intelligence and medicine course. It is in the lecture that Isan is actually giving. So if you're interested, you can go check that out, and this will also be discussed there. So next we will talk about the system for electronic health records that is used within Alberta. This is called Alberta Netcare. So basically, it is essentially just an electronic health record like I described in the previous slide. And physicians and other health providers will upload patient information onto this Netcare, and it will be accessible to other certified health providers. And also, if you're over 14, you can go onto Alberta Netcare and have access to your own medical history and data. This is also important to note because Alberta is uncommon in that we do have a consolidated electronic healthcare record system. In many other places, as I will talk about later in this presentation, there isn't such a thing. So if you have a patient record at one certain health system, it might not be transferable to another place because they use a different system for their electronic health record keeping. So next, we will talk about some of the problems with electronic health records right now. The two main ones are interoperability and ease of use. Mostly, I will be talking about interoperability because that can most directly be solved with natural language processing, but ease of use can also be improved with natural language processing. And so some of you might not know, but interoperability means the ability of two systems to exchange information. So this is when you have a Word document and you upload it onto Google Docs, you can still access it later as a document form because it's saved as the .docx form. So you can access the same document from many different systems, and it's easy to transfer information that way. And I also have a picture of a USB-C and USB adapter. So this is also an example of a way that information can be transferred from one system to another without losing its meaning. So as you can imagine, it's important for EHR systems to have this interoperability so that doctors can get information from different places. Just imagine like how difficult it would be if you had a Word document and if you wanted to access it on Google Documents, you have to like type it up again word for word. That would be really inconvenient, and that's why interoperability is important. So without interoperability, there can arise like many potential problems. For example, portability. If you have patient information stored in one location on their electronic health record system, if the patient gets injured in another location and they don't have access to their electronic health record, then the healthcare provider over there will not know the allergies, the specific afflictions of the patient, and they won't be able to understand the patient's medical history. So they won't be able to take into consideration the patient's unique circumstances when coming to a diagnosis or coming up with treatment plans. And secondly, there is the problem of ease of access. So if it is difficult for patients and doctors to access their medical information, there could be information lost in this process. And also it is frustrating for doctors to use such a system where a lot of information, important information, is very difficult to access when they already work in a very high stress environment and they don't have time to work a very complicated system. And thirdly, there's the difficulty of clarity. So if healthcare system records are not interoperable, it means that the information that they store is not also translatable between the healthcare record systems. So that means that if one healthcare record system contains a certain record of, for example, a patient's allergies as a different form than another electronic health record system, then it will be very difficult for doctors to recognize that and translate it. And this is also important for medical researchers and physicians who are trying to come up with innovative ideas, because if you don't have the data that is clear, then it's difficult to do any research on it, because it'll be very time consuming and labor intensive to sift through the data and find what you really want and need, what is necessary for you to create new products that are better. So if there is no information sharing, there is no new development. And the problem with this is that many healthcare record vendors, they don't want there to be information sharing between the healthcare record vendors, because this means that there will be more competition for them and it'll be more difficult for them to hold on to their established client base. Lastly, another problem is inefficiency. As I've mentioned, if it's difficult to access electronic healthcare records, then it will take more time, it will take more energy, and this could be better spent on doctors actually spending face time with patients rather than trying to look up their records or record their information in the record. So here are some more problems that can be present even if you have interoperability. Like I mentioned before, in Alberta, we are lucky that we have Netcare, which is actually consolidated and integrated across all healthcare provider systems within Alberta. But even though we have interoperability here, there are still many problems with it. So physician burnout is a common problem because right now we have to record many data and information in the chart of a patient. For example, if a patient is seen by a doctor for 1 hour, then the doctor will actually have to spend twice as much time, 2 hours, just writing down the information about the patient encounter and what they've observed about the patient. And this time, since also being a physician is already a very time intensive job and it's very stressful, it could be better spent on other more valuable things, like actually spending face time with the patient and doing things that are more conducive to the advancement of health research and improving our healthcare system. Also, there is redundant information because oftentimes, when doctors try to make a new chart for a patient, they copy and paste information from the previous chart. If the patient has already been seen by a different healthcare practitioner, then there will be leftover information that they could incorporate into the new chart very easily. So this is often they just copy and paste information from previous charts. And although this is convenient for physicians and it allows us to have the bulk of information that we need that is important about the patient, it gives us a lot of redundant information because within the patient's electronic healthcare record, there will be one tidbit about their healthcare situation or something that is copy pasted a bunch of times after they move from physician to physician and throughout the healthcare system. And third, there is an overwhelming quantity of information. So even if we don't have redundant information and information is recorded concisely, there's just a really large amount of information in the first place that is required to make a diagnosis. For example, you have to take, there are physical exams, there are laboratory tests and lab results. There are, for example, radiology scans. There are questions that you ask the patient and their answers to them. There's many different factors that a physician has to take into consideration when they're trying to come up with a diagnosis for a patient or a treatment plan. And so this massive amount of information is difficult to sift through and difficult to find things that are really important, or you can also miss things that are important, and it will cause adverse effects for the patients if you don't have the information that you need. So these problems can be solved with NLP, and I will discuss that on the next slide. So basically, with natural language processing, the program can automatically fill in patient charts between different electronic healthcare record systems. So if it can understand human language just like humans can, then it could read what the doctor has written and interpret the information and extract the important bits and then input it into a new electronic healthcare record system if the patient is moving between places, for example. And secondly, it can identify the most important information for physicians to know. And in the later part of this presentation, I will also give examples of how that is done. Basically, it can find the important information that is actually relevant to a diagnosis, or can notice some subtle things that a clinician might miss when they're trying to find, for example, a really rare disease. A clinician might miss these subtle signs, but an NLP can find them and bring them to the attention of a physician. And third, it can classify EHR data. So with unstructured text data, like in an electronic health record, there is the problem of it just being written like how we normally speak. It is not usually inputted within a structured format. So oftentimes doctor's notes will just be written as unstructured language. Then an LMP can come into play if it takes this data and classifies it as certain information that is useful for an actual medical researcher or a physician to use. So it can understand this type of data is relevant and that it's important for their research. And next, it can automatically collect data from patients. So if a patient comes in to a doctor with a certain complaint, it doesn't have to be they don't have to actually go to a clinic or try to or talk to the physician themselves before their actual appointment. They can talk to a natural language processing machine, and this NLP can collect the data and do some sort of like administrative work. So this sort of repetitive busy work, it doesn't have to be done by a physician. It can be done by an NLP, and it will help automate the workflow and make it more smooth. Lastly, the NLP can compile personalized information based on EHR data. So I will give an example later in this presentation, but based on the patient's unique medical history, it can give it unique treatment ideas. So since an NLP can take in much more information than a human doctor, they can take this information and use it to personalize the treatment and make it more unique and more effective for each patient. Okay, so now we will discuss some potential benefits and the state of the art of NLP, meaning what is currently being researched and what is on the cutting edge of this field. So some potential benefits, as I've mentioned before, is that we can have clear medical data for researchers and physicians to use. So if you've ever worked on a research project that collects data from existing sources and papers, then you know that it's important to classify it in a way that your program can understand, or in the way that what you're doing with the data can be processed. So it's important to fill it out in a very clear and concise way without excess information and in a format that is already suitable for the program that you're running. So an NLP can do this because it can extract the important information from unstructured text data. Like if someone just writes a sentence, it can extract the keywords from it, and then that will be used to fill in the blanks of what is actually needed in the data. This is for researchers and physicians so that they can invent better ways of keeping data, or it can help researchers who are looking into the epidemiology of a particular disease. Next, the next benefit is that it can help set a standard of healthcare records. So currently, as I mentioned, there's not really interoperability, meaning that there's not a certain way of how much healthcare records are recorded. So some information might be lost between different standards. And this is important because if certain physicians are cooperating with different physicians from another healthcare system, then they will not be able to exchange the same information as each other. And that will be difficult because there might be information loss that is actually important to what the patient is going through. Next is ease of communication. So as I mentioned before, if there is information loss, then it will be very difficult for the physician to identify what was lost. And if a patient happens to be out of province, for example, and they don't have access to the electronic health records, then it will be difficult for the physicians to know what's going on with them. An NLP can help with this because it can translate the doctor's notes from an electronic health record into the format that is used in another place, because it can identify the important information that is filled in. Next benefit is that there's less time charting used for the physicians. So they can actually spend more face time with patients, and they don't have to spend a long time charting and doing tedious paperwork. And next is that they can quickly identify patterns within the patient's electronic health record. As I mentioned before, this is important for chronic diseases because there's a long time in which the patient has had this disease, and any changes within it can be noticeable for a progression of the disease, or if you want to know if the disease is getting more dangerous or if there's a new development, things that are like that. And also, if there is a pattern within the patient's medical history that indicates a rare disease or something that's not very easily identifiable, or that has very generic symptoms, for example, a physician might not consider it because they might not think that such an uncommon disease would be seen. They might consider more common causes. But an NLP that can see this data, they can predict with more high accuracy whether or not the patient has this rare disease. I will give an example on this later in this presentation as well. So the current state of the art, the most commonly researched use for natural language processing in healthcare is extracting information. So this means that, like I mentioned before, it's like reading a sentence that someone wrote and taking the information from it that is actually important. There are 4 parts to this process. There's entity recognition, where it can identify one particular factor, like for example, someone's name, age, or birthday from a set of data. And secondly, it's anaphora resolution, and which is basically telling the the syntax and grammar of some word and language. Third is relationship extraction, which is telling the relationship between 2 variables, which is pretty self-explanatory. And lastly is event extraction, which means that it can understand that something has happened while reading a paragraph or a sentence. It can identify events that are most important and most relevant to what a patient has, what a patient's state is currently, and what event was the catalyst for certain things happening, stuff like that. So current research is mostly focused on the most effective natural language processing techniques to achieve these goals of data extraction. There's many technical details that I won't go into in this presentation, but essentially there's different techniques such as cutting a certain sentence in different ways and splicing together words different ways that will help the NLP create better outcomes. Okay. Next, we will move on from electronic health records and we'll start talking about chatbots. So basically chatbots, I'm sure you guys have known them before. There's Siri, which is the Apple chatbot that is a personal assistant. It can help you navigate roads. It can help you open apps and stuff like that. These are chatbots in healthcare. So certain functions of chatbots that can be used in healthcare are that they can provide mental illness support for people who don't have access to mental facilities or people who can help them with that, or therapy. It can help collect patient data. As I mentioned before, it can streamline the process of getting a patient admitted to a hospital or collecting the initial data that a physician needs to fill in their background information in a chart. Third, it can give information on symptoms. So I'm sure all of you have at one point entered your symptoms into Google and seen what illnesses have come up that you might be afflicted with. But in chatbots, this is more sophisticated because these are actually backed by deep learning and legitimate health information databases. And the chatbot can search these databases and match you with the illness that is most closely related to your symptoms. Of course, this doesn't replace a doctor's visit, which I will come to later on. It can also answer insurance questions. So these things that are administrative tasks that don't necessarily need a person to help you with, you don't have to wait for a long time because a chatbot can talk with many people at once, and this can decrease the congestion of the number of people who are asking an administrative assistant questions about their insurance. This can also help you book doctor appointments if you're searching for a specific healthcare need and you need a certain specialist or physician to help you, then a chatbot can search near you and it can find a physician that suits your needs best. So on the right, I have a picture of one of the chatbots that is currently available right now, and it is actually one of the examples that I have on the next page, which is about currently available chatbots. So first of all, I have a Wobot, which is it's a cognitive behavioral therapist bot. It can also guide you through mindfulness exercises and dialectic behavioral therapy. So basically, it helps you with your mental health, and it is like a replacement therapist for those who don't have the access to a real therapist. Secondly, there is Babylon, which is a symptom checker. It's similar to what I described on the previous slide, where you can enter in your symptoms and Babylon can use those symptoms to check against its database and give you an illness that is most closely related to your symptoms. Third is Beyond Verbal, which is an Israeli startup that can apparently detect depression from the tone of voice of the user. So if you talk to the bot, then it can tell whether or not you're depressed or you're happy. It can even understand like a wide variety of different emotions from your voice. So fourth, there is the cancer chatbot. So it can help you monitor cancer symptoms. If you or one of your family members works in a place that has like many carcinogens and it has a danger of causing them to like be predisposed to cancer, for example, then the chatbot can help you monitor those symptoms and pay attention to whether or not these symptoms show up and whether or not you should be concerned and should go to a physician to get checked for cancer. So fifth is Super Izzy, which is a bot that helps women track their menstrual cycles and answers women's health questions. This can, for example, it can give you a notification and remind you of taking your pill for like, what's the word? Okay, never mind. It can help you remember to take the pill, and it can help you track your menstrual cycle and when you ovulate and answer your health questions. So on the bottom right hand corner, I have a picture of Woebot. So that is the first bot that I talked about, and there's its logo. Okay, now we'll talk about some benefits and limitations to chatbots. So first of all, there's convenient access to healthcare information. For example, one robot that I didn't talk about on the previous slide, but that is relevant to this is COVID Asha, which is a chatbot that was employed in India for civilians to use when they needed to access a critical care facility. So it can direct, it will like give them access to the resources that they need for if they are afflicted with COVID. So this is important in places where like citizens have less access to medical care. So it can help them find it and get them the help that they need. So the second benefit is that it can reduce the doctor's workload. Like I mentioned before, the like chatbots can collect patient data, and it allows physicians to not have to do this sort of like menial tasks. Third, nowadays, many people prefer text over talking, so the chatbot may be more comfortable for them to talk to than a real person, or they might prefer to use a chatbot to text about a doctor's appointment rather than calling for a doctor's appointment, for example. And fourth, it can help distribute reliable health information. So another example of this that is relevant is another COVID bot that was employed in, I think it was the UK, and it was used to distribute reliable healthcare information rather than misinformation. So, and it would give it the current status of COVID in their country. So some limitations of chatbot, however, is of course it's not a replacement for doctors. It can be a sort of medical assistant and help doctors fill in charts and do some busy work. But if a patient really has an illness, then of course they would have to go to a doctor to actually get an official diagnosis, and also for the doctor to come up with a treatment plan for them. And also there's limitations to the kind of questions that chatbots can answer. If you have used like Siri or other chatbots before, you will know that like there's sort of an interesting phenomenon where they don't really remember things that you've told them, for example, 2 or 3 questions back. If you ask a few questions in a row, they will forget the context of the previous questions. And if you ask new questions, they will answer them like as if they haven't heard the last part of the conversation. So in this way, it kind of like is a bit lacking. And this is just a general part of like every single chatbot out there, not just medical chatbots. Of course, there's also, they can't really like give you medical advice on like what to do. You would have to see a doctor on that. in order for you to actually be treated for your disease. And lastly, there's the problem of user privacy. If users actually talk to these chatbots and give up their private healthcare information, the vendors of these chatbots are usually just private companies, so there's a wide range of different standards for their privacy. So you might not be giving your information to a private source, and for like you would have to read their privacy policy very carefully in order to know what you're getting into. Okay, so here we're going to come to some other applications of natural language processing in healthcare. So these are sort of varied and less common. So that is why I've separated them into individual slides instead of clumping them into a section. So for natural language processing in medical education, it can be used at many different stages of medical education. For example, it can be used to evaluate residents on accomplishment of learning milestones based on the attendings evaluations. So it can take in information from the attendings evaluations of a certain medical resident, and from analysis of the textual information, it can determine whether a resident has achieved the learning milestone or not. Like, for example, if they have successfully learned how to talk to a patient during a difficult situation, or whether or not they have successfully achieved the milestone of being able to individually practice. So next, it can evaluate the ability of third-year medical students to write a differential diagnosis. So it can take the differential diagnoses that these medical students have written and look into them for the structure of the language and the keywords that they use in order to determine if it fits the standard of writing a good differential diagnosis or not. Lastly, through the transcript of recorded learning sessions between attendings and currently learning doctors like residents, then the NLP can show whether or not the students are improving or not, because they can analyze the transcripts of these sessions and see whether or not the student is gradually becoming more clinically ready. So yeah, next application. So NLP can also compile personalized drug information. So adverse drug reactions is quite a serious problem. There are many people who die from it, and lots of people don't really report it because they don't really know what's going on. So this is why what is called pharmacovigilance is important, meaning that we need to know that these drugs are not compatible together, or we need to know that these drugs may have side effects, certain side effects that are not common but may show up, for example. And if an individual doesn't know that and they don't suspect that this is going on, then they will not be able to report it to their physician. And this will be even more dangerous because people will not know how common this side effect really is. So future patients who are prescribed this drug will not be well informed of the risks of taking it. So a NLP can extract information from web forums such as Twitter and Instagram to combat the underreporting of these adverse drug effects. For example, there was one study where a bot was able to take a lot of information of patients who did complain about their adverse drug effects and the side effects that they experienced, but it was on a Twitter or Instagram or Reddit or something. And they used all of this information to compile information on the drugs side effects that were previously unknown. So then after they have a better idea of what side effects these drugs actually have based on a person's electronic health record, they can see what drugs they're taking and understand the potential interactions between the drugs, and then compile a report to give to the patients so that the patient is informed of what potential side effects that these drugs might have and what reactions they might have with each other. So the challenges to this are quality of information. Of course, if people are just like complaining about their symptoms on like Twitter or Instagram or like another web forum, then they won't have like a very strict way of saying things, and they might not like be truthful even. But there are certain ways to like to uh, combat this within the artificial intelligence technology, but I won't go into it now. Secondly, there's data privacy. If we are harvesting information from these web forums, then it will be difficult to protect the privacy of people who are writing about their symptoms there, right? Um, Third, it's difficult to identify relevant information. Like I said, one of the most hotly discussed topics in natural language processing is how to get machines to identify the most important information from an unstructured text, unstructured piece of text. So how will it determine whether or not this is important to what it is trying to determine? This is also currently being studied, so I won't go into the technical details of how it's done. Fourth, it's scalability. So there's many different natural language processing programs out there, and all of them have different processing power. So if you are trying to get information from a large body of data, for example, like hundreds of thousands of Twitter posts and Instagram posts and things like that, then you might not have like even the power to process all of them. So that's just like, that is another like technical problem that can be overcome through more like innovation. And fifth is how to achieve pharmacovigilance, how to make sure that people know what drugs they have and what adverse effects that they can encounter with these drugs. Next is natural language processing for palliative care. There are a couple of areas where natural language processing can be used effectively for palliative care. So for example, it can rapidly assess whether or not end-of-life process measures have been completed. For example, if someone is approaching the end of life, then a natural language processing program can look at their electronic health record and see if they've had the conversation of goals of end-of-life care with a physician, or if they have they have had certain surgeries, and whether or not they have discussed with their family the goals of care. So this can assist with the administration of those in palliative care, and it can, as I mentioned previously, it can smoothen out the workflow for physicians and make it easier for people to transition into palliative care. And secondly, it can identify patients with uncommon deadly diseases from information in their electronic health record. And it can identify those who can't be identified from structured data codes. So basically, structured data codes are a way that has been developed for certain diseases to be identified more concisely. So these illnesses or like afflictions are identified with a certain like code, a short code, and it can effectively communicate what a patient is experiencing. But the problem with this is that more uncommon illnesses are not found easily because there's no code to represent them. And so with the natural language processing, it can look at a patient's electronic health record and identify whether or not these patients are likely to have these uncommon diseases. So this is actually much more effective than human coders. So it can do this very rapidly and do with a high accuracy as well. So it can help identify those who with like deadly disease that might kill them otherwise if they are not found. Next. So natural language processing can also combat COVID-19 misinformation. Like in the previous slide that I talked about, there was a COVID-19 bot that was combating misinformation by giving out actually reliable information though for those who like were asking it questions. It can identify illicit cures peddled for COVID-19 on Twitter and Instagram. So if there are like scammers who want to sell you a cure for COVID-19 that is not actually legitimate, then it can identify these on Twitter and Instagram and alert authorities so that they can remove these sort of products. It can also discover the trends in the kinds of fake products being sold. So apparently in the first wave of the pandemic, it was mostly the immunity boosting treatments that were being sold. And in the second wave, there were more like suspicious testing kits that were being sold. So in this way, we can like sort of see the trends and what is going on with misinformation and help to prevent it. Another application of natural language processing in COVID-19 is that it can identify prognostic factors for admission to the intensive care unit and ICU. So it can analyze the electronic health record of COVID-19 patients using the natural language processing, right? And it can identify the symptoms that are most likely to occur in a patient who is later admitted to the ICU. This can allow better understanding of the epidemiology of COVID-19 and identify which factors are potentially of most interest for like seeing what exactly COVID-19 affects and how it becomes more severe. So apparently, with the study that I researched, there was age, fever, and tachypnea. I have no idea how to pronounce that word. But these are the three factors that were found to be most common in those who were later admitted to the ICU. Okay, I have completed my presentation. So if there are any questions, you can ask me. And my email is up on the screen. So if you think of a question later, you can also email me. Thank you for joining my presentation. Thank you.